Scotland is a nation dear to my heart. My grandfather's family, as far as I can tell, come from the area between Loch Lomond and Stirling, an area that conjures up images of the Scottish Wars of Independence. It is a gateway into the Southern Highlands, and around the year 1700, it would have been a borderland between Scots, a Germanic language along the south and along the east, and Scottish Gaelic to the northwest, a Celtic language. But this Celtic language was already being pushed back long before the union of Scotland and England in 1707. Scotland is very different in this case linguistically from Wales or Cornwall, which had English imposed from without. It is different from Brittany, whose upper class turned to French, whilst its own people spoke Breton, because Scots was spoken by the people of Scotland, and then later adopted by its rulers. It is nothing like the Isle of Man, which was fought over by outside powers. Nor is Scotland like Ireland, in which there was largely one spoken language, until the invasions. Of what are typically called the Celtic Nations, Scotland is remarkably different, in that even in pre-Roman times, with Proto-Pictish forming in the northeast as a different language to British, Scotland has never been a monolingual nation. And contrary to the other so-called Celtic nations, its emergence as a political state was in opposition to Celtic-speaking polities. So I must ask the question, is Scotland a Celtic nation? Hi, I'm Benjamin, and to answer the question, is Scotland a Celtic nation, we need to assess what is Celtic. Is it a legal structure with a common inheritance like Roman law or English common law? A Celtic language family? Is it ethnic, genetic? Is it architectural, musical? Is it a common geography? Is it culinary? Is it a common religious faith? Or is it a vestige of being ruled by a common enemy that left a bitterness of hatred in the taste of the mouth toward another? Or is it a common culture? But what is a culture? Take food, for instance. Scotland is famous for haggis, sheep in inner bits, cooked in its own stomach, with herbs, onions, and bits of oatmeal. Is that kosher? I mean, I've had haggis. It's delicious, but not since I've begun eating kosher. I'll put yes or no here. In any case, I don't think there's anything quite like it in some of the other Celtic nations. I could be wrong. The Cornish like their pasties. Nice. The Breton across the water are very maritime, with flaky bakey bits and more vegetables. We in Wales have potato and leek soup. The Scots have cock-a-leekie, which ultimately comes from France. They just shifted the onion into leeks, and I'm sure most of we Welsh approve of the leeks. The Irish have potato bread. But the point is, there's nothing that distinguishes their culinary culture from the English, really, that much. I mean, there are differences, absolutely. But you can't say that it's Celtic by cuisine. Each of these nations have a bit of their own type of cooking. But what about something more concrete, more specific to running a country? Law. In the 10th century, Wales under Hywel the Good, codified its laws, which were a collection of ancient folk traditions, with a few amendments. Meanwhile in Ireland, the judges, or Brahim, gave Ireland Brehon law, whose ideas are so old we are not even sure how old this legal system was. But it shares many ideas with Welsh law, such as the disastrous idea to share estates equally between sons, which meant neither Irish nor the Welsh could gather political power over generations as a state to compete with their neighbours. This law also gave women inheritance rights, which is reflected in Welsh law to an even greater degree than in Ireland. Both Irish and Welsh law were insanely hierarchical and created a permanent slave class. Cornwall would have had laws very similar to Welsh laws at one point, but this country was conquered early and did not re-emerge with its own legal distinctions until the 14th century and the Stannary Parliament, which gave rights and privileges to tin miners. Meanwhile, across the water in Brittany, the legal structure did inherit ideas similar to Welsh and Irish, meaning it was decentralized, but it was different because it was influenced by Celtic law from the old Frankish kingdom. Brittany saw a fusion emerging of French legal systems and oral laws similar to Welsh. Further north, in the Isle of Man, a legal structure was born out of the fusion between Gaelic Brehon law and the Norse Viking laws of Udal. Out of this, the Isle of Man established the Tynwald. Its founding date is debatable, but certainly before 1200. From the 16th century, it took on a more English common law character in its ideas. Which brings me to Scotland and Scots law, where Wales and Ireland had their native traditions swept aside and English common law imposed, Cornwall as well, but Wales and Ireland first developing its own legal structure on top of English common law, and Wales just beginning to, and Brittany, the French Revolution was devastating. The Isle of Man, a different case, but Scotland has its own native indigenous legal structure that it maintained intact. The Kingdom of Alba emerged in the 9th century, and the language more than likely used was Scottish Gaelic, but it was under heavy influence from an Anglic language, Scots, in the south, with Cumbric Welsh speakers in the southwest, and a faint Pictish memory being absorbed from the northeast, with Norse coming down from the North Sea, from Shetland and Orkney. Each of these peoples had their own legal traditions which began to fuse together, forming the basis of law in the emerging Scottish kingdom. Then the Norman French invaded further south, and the Anglo-Norman law became the prestige along with continental legal systems. King David I, in the 12th century, pushed out Celtic influences, expanded the kingdom, and brought in English legal ideas based around feudalism and kingship. This made Scotland completely different in legal structure, not only setting it apart from Wales and Ireland, but from the 12th century Scotland began to colonize itself, culturally pushing back both the Cumbrians, or Welsh, and more importantly for this context, the Gaels, establishing French as the prestige culture on one hand, and Scots as the common tongue of the nation on the other. See my video on how the Flemish influenced Scotland. But as for law, Scotland is both far more Anglic than Celtic, and more distinct from England than Ireland or Wales. It built a legal tradition that has survived. And as for the Scots language, let us turn to language now. In the introduction to this video, I touched a bit on language. So let's start with that guy, David I. He had a kingdom with an immense Scottish Gaelic speaking heartland to the northwest, and an arc of Cumbric Welsh to his south. He colonized out his frontiers using boroughs, bringing in Flemish settlers who were absorbed into the Scots language specifically, expanding that outward. Around the time that Wales was fighting its failed wars of independence in the late 13th century, up until the early bits of the First Scottish War of Independence in the early 14th century, Scots really consolidates itself in Scotland as the medium of resistance against the English, a Germanic language. By the 15th century and the Renaissance, the language of the Scottish institutions was firmly Scots, and Scotland is the only of the so-named Celtic nations to truly experience the fruits of the Renaissance in the language of its own people. Yes, Wales and the Welsh language gave it a good go, but our language in Wales did not have political and institutional power enjoyed by Scots, a Germanic language. I do need to say, however, that Scots has clear Celtic influence from Cumbric Welsh and Scottish Gaelic both. It is far more Celtic than English, but it is a sister language of English in the Anglic language family, alongside Frisian on the coast of Friesland on the continent, and not too distant in some limited cases to Dutch. No other nation of these six, Wales, Cornwall, Mann, Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, none of them formed an indigenous non-Celtic language that became the medium of an independent state, which then resisted conquest through this language. Scots became the medium of poetry, resisting the English. Ethnicity, some people say Celtic is a race or genetic, and I'm very proud of my Scottish ancestry. It's a deep part of who I am. But I'm also part Cornish, and those two sides of me are very different. In fact, see my DNA video. The DNA that I have from Norway could be part of the Scottish inheritance that I have. I don't know, it could be through the German, probably through the Scottish, because of the North Sea interactions. But on the Cornish side, it's more similar genetically to the north of Spain sometimes in Asturias than it is to the north of Wales in Gwynedd. And that's my way of saying I don't really buy this idea of a Celtic race. It has never been one thing. Within Scotland there's variation of its own again. The northeast of Scotland is very specific genetically. And since I'm not left-wing, so I don't believe in this hierarchy of victimhood oppressor to do with racial groups, I'd rather not define Celtic by genetic identity in any way. So let's look at something that unites people: religious faith. The religious faith of the 16th century was insane. Most of the British Isles and France had been Christian for over a millennium by the 16th century. But have a look at this map of the Protestant Reformation's influence. Cornwall and Wales, being ruled directly by England, fell under Anglicanism. To be fair to the Cornish, they got a bit more angry about this than the Welsh. But the Breton over the sea remained Catholic. The Isle of Man also fell under sway of the English monarchy and was basically told to be Anglican. Ireland's history is a story of Catholic resistance against Anglicanism, with a pocket of it growing in the north, transplanted. But after the beginnings of this in Northern Ireland, it wasn't finished yet. Scotland had its own Reformation, because as a sovereign state acknowledged abroad, it had its own church and its own institutions. This is where we get Presbyterians, which is a Protestant ethos church governed by assemblies of elders, which is completely different to Anglicanism or Catholicism. Scotland is set apart from Wales in that Catholicism survived in pockets. It is also different from the others in that a second Reformation, which was a complete mess, tried to begin in Scotland and floundered badly. The Scots know how to create a bit of anarchy over religious disagreement, whilst we Welsh come together and form order in religious disagreement. That's quite a contrast. And yes, if you are watching this from Japan or India, it is all Christianity. It is a cultural inheritance that created our Western civilization, but it is not one that is unique to any Celtic civilization. We are part of the Judeo-Greco-Roman West. So what does make Scotland Celtic? I have heard some folks say a sense of economic collectivism is Celtic, like buying rounds in a pub, or spreading out welfare to the poor, or singing together. But really, is it? The Northern English along Scotland's border, and the Basques, and the Galicians and the Portuguese further south, they all share this ethos. It seems more of an Atlantic coastal culture than Celtic. Even so, the Manx and Irish have chosen liberal economic globalization and international finance. Some say Celtic is some kind of struggle fighting colonialism, some heroic underdog story. Does that mean Norway, who was ruled over by other powers, is Celtic? Even if that were true, does freedom or having a working economy make us lose our Celtic identity once we free ourselves from being victims? And Scotland is certainly worth more than an endless social justice parade ranting against whichever group is fashionable to hate that year. And Scottish history is indeed full of great aristocrats, Tories, kings, and men of industry, imperialists, distinctly more so than Wales, Brittany, or Ireland. Cornwall and Mann, however, are so small it is difficult to say. Whilst I am glad these nations have affinity for each other, there does not seem to be much linking Scotland to all of the other so-named Celtic nations, except for one thing. What do you think that is? From what I can see, all 6 nations have only one trait they share which does not belong in some way to either France, England, or Norway. And that is, each of them have a language which uses first letter mutations, verb first word order, and conjugation of prepositions, such as this example from Scottish Gaelic on the screen now. They join the person and the connecting word together. And these languages, even though they really are 2 language families, British and Irish, they are commonly called Celtic. A core part of their vocabulary, though often distant from each other as Slavic and Baltic, is closer by far to each other than Germanic or Romance. Is Scotland a Celtic nation? Obviously in this I've focused a lot on the Anglic influence, the Germanic heritage, and I've done that for a reason. It's the only Celtic nation which you can do that for, and have its story as a nation still make complete sense. I would say, or I do say, Scotland is an Anglic country with Celtic nuance. By Anglic I mean Scotland, England, and the Netherlands. England is an Anglic country with French nuance, and the Netherlands is an Anglic country with Germanic or German nuance. So that makes Scotland very rich, I think, and an interesting fusion of where these 2 worlds collided, but its core identity, upon which the Kingdom of Scotland was built, is not Celtic. But I would not want a Scotland, in any case, without the parts of it that are Celtic. May I take this opportunity to thank my Patreons on the screen now. If you would like to help the channel, please consider a donation, super like, or buy me a coffee.